Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Before we even get into the material today, do me a huge favor.
Oh yeah, visual housekeeping.
Exactly. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure your notifications are turned on so you never miss out on the incredible source material we unpack here.
Sure.
Today, we are reviewing a highly requested, incredibly detailed ebook. It's titled Feminism's Silent War: How Women Control and Destroy Men by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
It's a heavy one.
It really is, and I want to be crystal clear right out of the gate about who this specific deep dive is designed for.
Right.
This analysis is specifically tailored for a men's rights activist audience and for the red-pilled manosphere men out there listening. If you were looking to understand the history of our institutions before they were captured by feminists and Marxists, at least according to the framework laid out in this text, this book is absolutely essential reading.
Absolutely.
So as you listen today and evaluate these arguments for yourself, I highly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Yeah, get the primary source.
And you're also going to want to follow @Conrad and Riker on Substack for more content exploring these exact themes.
And before we open the book and really begin analyzing the text itself, it is absolutely crucial that we set some very firm ground rules for today's discussion.
Yeah, we have to put this out there.
This book contains highly politically charged content. I mean, it touches on some of the most sensitive, polarizing cultural debates of our modern era. So I want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that neither of us here is taking any sides today.
Yep.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, we are not validating the arguments, and we are not aligning ourselves with the political stances of the author.
Not at all.
Our mission today is purely analytical. We are here to impartially report, unpack, and synthesize the ideas contained in the original source material.
Right.
Our goal is to give you a comprehensive, objective look at the author's perspective so you can fully understand the structural arguments being presented in the text, regardless of your personal stance on the issues.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today's deep dive is going to cover a massive amount of ideological ground.
A ton of ground.
We are going to explore the author's historical arguments, specifically how she claims history has been rewritten to serve a modern narrative.
Yeah, she starts right at the foundation.
Then we'll unpack the psychological concepts introduced in the book. And for those of you familiar with manosphere dynamics, you'll recognize terms like the shit test.
Oh yeah?
But we'll also look at how she connects that to deeper psychological theories like animus possession.
Which is a fascinating angle.
We are going to examine the author's claims regarding an alleged unholy alliance with Marxism. And finally, we will detail her extensive claims regarding the systemic capture of legal, educational, and media institutions.
It is a vast structural critique. And the author begins this undertaking in Chapter 1 by attempting to, completely dismantle what she calls the historical lie of the patriarchy.
The historical lie.
Right. The core assertion driving the beginning of the book is that the patriarchy, exactly as modern intersectional feminism defines it, is an ahistorical myth.
So she's saying it basically didn't exist the way we're told.
Exactly. Riker argues that modern feminist historians have retroactively applied a lens of oppression to eras that were actually defined by deep, necessary collaboration between the sexes.
Okay.
And she uses the Industrial Revolution as her primary case study for this retroactive framing.
So how does she deconstruct the Industrial Revolution? Because, the standard textbook narrative we are all taught is that this was a dark age of patriarchal dominance.
Right, the classic narrative.
Like where men essentially lorded over women in factories and forced them into domestic servitude at home. How does the text challenge that baseline assumption?
By focusing intensely on mortality rates and labor conditions. Riker argues that the reality of the Industrial Revolution was not oppression, but a brutal, shared struggle for survival. Yeah, where men and women had to work together to build a better future. The book argues that the nuclear family didn't emerge as a tool to subjugate women, but as a stabilizing force, born out of pure economic necessity.
That makes sense.
The text claims that feminist historians cherry-picked the historical record. They conveniently ignore the fact that men were the ones taking on the most lethal roles in society.
The dangerous jobs.
Exactly. She points to the men risking their lives and literally working themselves to death in coal mines, steel mills, and heavy manufacturing, just to provide for their families.
The book uses a very specific historical comparison here that I want to ask about. She brings up the Lowell Mill girls.
Ah, Yes.
Because in modern historical narratives, the Lowell Mill girls are frequently held up as the ultimate symbols of female exploitation and patriarchal abuse during the 19th century.
Right.
But Riker frames their working conditions as a walk in the park compared to what men were doing. What metrics is she using to justify that comparison?
She relies on occupational hazard data from the era, while acknowledging that textile mills were difficult environments. The author contrasts them with the hellish, fatal environments that men endured in heavy industries.
Like what specifically?
Things like structural collapses in mines, explosions in steel foundries, and the long-term lethality of black lung.
Wow.
To quantify this, the text highlights a stark demographic reality from that period. Male life expectancy actually dropped significantly during the height of the Industrial Revolution.
It actually dropped.
Yes. The author's argument is that this drop occurred precisely because men were working themselves into early graves to fund and protect their families. By omitting this sacrifice, the text claims modern history paints the provider as the oppressor.
That is a fundamental paradigm shift in how we are taught to view the division of labor. And she doesn't just isolate this argument to the 19th century, does she?
You know, she goes way back.
Right, she goes much further back in the timeline to argue that history is actually filled with examples of women in incredibly powerful, non-oppressed roles, which contradicts the idea of a universal, timeless patriarchy.
What's fascinating here is how the author systematically attempts to strip modern feminism of its foundational victimhood narrative by pointing to what she argues were historical norms rather than anomalies.
Okay, give me an example.
She takes the reader to 14th century Paris.
14th century Paris.
Yeah, detailing how women in medieval guilds weren't just background participants. The text asserts they were actively running businesses, owning property, and holding significant leadership roles within the merchant class.
She also brings up ancient Egyptian women, right?
She does.
The book notes they ruled as pharaohs, initiated divorces, and held property rights independent of their husbands.
Exactly.
And then she pivots to medieval Japan, citing samurai women who were highly trained in martial arts and fought on the battlefield alongside men.
Right.
What is the overarching rhetorical goal of jumping across all these different eras and cultures?
The goal is to establish a pattern of historical partnership. The author is trying to reframe the timeline of human civilization as a collaborative enterprise, much like the American frontier, which she also cites, where men and women had to work side by side to survive the harsh realities of nature.
Just to stay alive.
Right. By highlighting these examples, Riker is arguing that the concept of a perpetual global gender war, where women were historically nothing more than helpless pawns, is a modern invention designed to generate grievance.
I want you, the listener, to consider how this aligns with the history you've been taught. How often have you been presented with a historical narrative that completely erases or downplays male sacrifice?
That's a great question.
Because the author tackles some subjects where the narrative is incredibly entrenched. For example, the witch hunts.
Oh, this part is wild.
The standard cultural understanding is that the witch trials were the ultimate gender genocide, like a targeted campaign by men to eradicate women. But the book cites a statistic that completely upends that. Can you explain the data she uses from Iceland?
Yes, the author uses the witch trials to demonstrate how history is curated to fit a specific ideological framework. While acknowledging that in some regions more women were persecuted, the text points out that this was not a universal gendered rule. The book cites a staggering statistic from Iceland.
What's the number?
It claims that 90% of those executed for witchcraft there were male.
90% male.
Yeah. She uses this data point to argue that the witch hunts were driven by religious hysteria, property disputes, and class anxieties, rather than a monolithic, patriarchal conspiracy against women.
She applies that same critical lens to the women's suffrage movement, too.
She really does.
The text points out that the 19th Amendment in the United States didn't happen in a vacuum. It only passed because men in Congress who held the exclusive political power at the time actually voted to pass it.
Exactly. They had to agree to it.
The author uses this to argue that it wasn't a hostile takeover by women, but an act that required direct male collaboration and consent.
And her critique goes deeper into the suffragette movement itself, specifically focusing on the United Kingdom. She analyzes Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. The author does not portray these figures as the peaceful, noble protesters we often see in modern cinema or textbooks.
How does she portray them?
Instead, she explicitly frames them as terrorists.
That's a heavy accusation. What historical actions is the book attributing to the WSPU to justify labeling them as terrorists?
The book details their open endorsement and execution of militant tactics. Riker notes that the WSPU engaged in organized arson campaigns, bombings of public infrastructure, and physical assaults on politicians.
Bombings and arson.
Yes. The author argues that these tactics were so extreme, they actually alienated the general public and delayed the suffrage cause.
Wow.
She brings this up to set the stage for a larger argument that from its earliest iterations, the feminist movement has possessed an underlying thread of radical, destructive behavior.
So if the author is arguing that this destructive thread has always been there, how does she connect that historical foundation to the modern day?
That's where things get really intense.
Because the book makes a massive pivot here to argue that modern feminism isn't operating alone anymore. It has supposedly merged with a completely different political ideology.
That brings us to the author's central thesis, which dominates the subsequent chapters, the assertion that modern feminism is intrinsically allied with intersectional Marxism.
Okay.
The book claims that both of these ideologies share a fundamental structural architecture. They both thrive on societal division. According to the text, both frameworks operate by categorizing the world strictly into oppressors versus the oppressed, using that division to systematically dismantle traditional systems, institutions, and cultural norms.
Before we get into how she says this is happening today, let's look at the historical precedent she uses.
Yeah.
The book points to the Soviet Union as the ultimate cautionary tale of this alliance in action. How does Riker describe the Soviet regime's use of feminism? Because usually we think of the Soviet Union strictly in terms of class and economics.
Riker writes that the Soviet regime strategically co-opted feminist ideology as a tool for absolute state control.
Okay, how?
Under the guise of promoting gender equality and liberating women from domestic labor, the text argues that the state's true objective was to dismantle traditional family structures.
Right.
By pushing women out of the home and into the state-controlled workforce and simultaneously eroding the legal and cultural role of the father, the family unit was weakened.
So taking power away from the parents.
Exactly. The end goal, according to the book's analysis, wasn't female empowerment. It was to remove the family as a buffer between the individual and the government, making the state the ultimate, unquestionable authority in every citizen's life.
I want to ask for an explain. I'm 5 on a term the book relies on heavily here.
Sure.
The author traces the intellectual roots of this Marxist-feminist alliance back to something called the Frankfurt School in Critical Theory.
Right.
For a listener who isn't steeped in 20th century political philosophy, what exactly are those, and how does the author say they created this ideological alliance?
Certainly. To put it simply, the Frankfurt School was a group of Marxist intellectuals who fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and eventually settled in the United States, largely at Columbia University.
Okay.
They realized that traditional economic Marxism, where the working class rises up against the wealthy, wasn't taking hold in the prosperous West.
Because people were generally doing okay financially.
Exactly. So they developed critical theory. Instead of focusing just on economics, critical theory focuses on culture.
Culture.
It teaches that traditional social systems, language, and specifically the nuclear family, are hidden mechanisms of capitalist control. The author argues that critical theory shifted the Marxist target from the factory owner to the traditional father.
And the book points to Simone de Beauvoir as the bridge between this new cultural Marxism and feminism, right?
Yes.
Riker cites de Beauvoir's famous book, The Second Sex. How does the author frame that specific text?
The author views The Second Sex as the foundational document that explicitly linked the Marxist critique of capitalism with the feminist critique of gender roles.
So merging the two ideas.
Riker argues that de Beauvoir adopted the Marxist framework of class struggle and simply copy-pasted it onto men and women. Men became the bourgeoisie oppressors, and women became the proletariat oppressed.
And the author's primary warning to the reader is that this isn't just dusty mid-century academic theory. She claims this framework has successfully executed a hostile takeover of our modern institutions.
It's happening right now, according to her.
Let's start with her claims about the education system. The book points to a highly publicized incident from 2021 in the Virginia public school system. What exactly does the author claim happened there?
Riker uses the 2021 Virginia School Board controversies as a prime example of institutional capture.
Okay.
The text details how parents discovered that concepts derived from critical race theory and intersectional feminism were being integrated into the standard curriculum.
Right, there was a lot of pushback.
The author argues that these ideological frameworks are not just teaching history differently, they are actively psychologically conditioning students.
In what way?
Specifically, the book claims these programs teach young boys that they are inherent oppressors simply by virtue of being male, and often white, saddlebagging them with historical guilt before they've even reached adulthood.
If that's the claim for education, how does the author quantify the capture of the media? Because everyone has opinions on media bias, but the book actually brings in statistical studies to back up this idea of a coordinated narrative.
Yes, the institutional capture extends heavily into media and digital platforms. The book cites a 2022 sociological study which analyzed media framing.
What did they find?
According to this study, 75% of gender-related media stories actively frame women in a positive, empathetic light, while framing men in a negative, critical, or adversarial light.
That's a massive skew, and she looks at social media too, specifically Instagram.
Correct. The author references a 2022 report from the Digital Media Research Center, which found that 85% of gender-related content on Instagram is distinctly pro-feminist in its orientation.
85%.
Yeah. Riker argues that social media conglomerates act as the enforcement arm for this ideology.
By doing what?
The text asserts that these platforms utilize algorithmic digital censorship to shadow ban, flag as hate speech, or outright remove male-positive content or legitimate criticisms of feminism, all while allowing blatant misandry to flourish on the platform without penalty.
The book introduces a concept here called the equality paradox. Can you break down what the author means by that and how she claims it impacts the corporate world?
The equality paradox, as defined by the author, occurs when the definition of equality shifts from equal opportunity to equal outcome.
Okay.
Riker argues that when institutions push for perfectly engineered equal outcomes, they must inherently abandon meritocracy.
Because they're forcing a result.
Right. By implementing quotas to ensure a specific demographic result, the system inevitably has to discriminate against qualified individuals from the oppressor class, in this case men.
The text gives a really stark example of this happening in the tech sector. The book describes a major technology company that launched a heavily funded, women-only coding bootcamp.
Yeah, this is a clear example.
According to the author, this program explicitly excluded highly qualified male applicants solely based on their gender, all under the banner of promoting diversity and inclusion.
And that paradox is central to understanding the author's critique of the corporate world. When merit is replaced by ideological quotas, systemic discrimination becomes the official policy.
To put some data behind that, the author heavily references another book titled The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. Riker uses data from that text to make a pretty alarming claim about human resources departments. What does she say about companies that adopt these feminist-aligned diversity programs?
Relying on data from the dictatorship of woke capital, the author claims that corporations with heavily entrenched, feminist-aligned diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are actually 25% more likely to exhibit measurable discrimination against male employees.
25% more likely.
In their hiring, promotion, and retention practices, yes. The argument is that corporate HR departments have transformed from administrative bodies into ideological enforcers, actively punishing men to achieve their diversity metrics.
So, if the author's premise is that these massive macro-level institutions, schools, the media, Fortune 500 corporations are enforcing this ideology from the top down, how does she say that trickles down to regular everyday interactions? Does the book explore how this ideological capture impacts dating and interpersonal relationships?
It does, extensively. Moving from the institutional level down to the interpersonal, the book dedicates a significant portion of its analysis to what the author terms the psychological battlefield.
Psychological battlefield.
The text argues that decades of feminist ideology have not just changed legal codes, they have fundamentally altered how men and women communicate, actively encouraging women to weaponize emotional manipulation in their relationships with men.
If you are familiar with manosphere literature, you absolutely know the concept we're about to discuss, the shit test.
Oh yeah, very common term.
It's a very common term, but the book formalizes it within this broader ideological framework. How does Riker define the mechanics of a shit test in the context of this psychological battlefield?
Riker defines the shit test as a deliberate, often subconscious tactic used by women to probe a man's psychological boundaries and assert emotional dominance.
Okay.
While they are often disguised as innocent compatibility checks or casual questions, the author describes them as emotional minefields.
The book gives some very relatable examples of this. It mentions the classic trap of a partner asking, "Does this dress make me look fat?" Or utilizing the silent treatment for days on end without explaining why. How does the author say a man is supposed to navigate this, according to the female psychology she's describing?
According to the text, it is a game designed so the man can never truly win,
Never win.
right? If a man fails the test, perhaps by getting visibly upset, apologizing unnecessarily, or fumbling for the right answer, he is deemed weak and loses the woman's respect.
And if he passes?
However, if he passes the test by remaining stoic or setting a boundary, he also claims the goalposts will immediately move, and a new, more difficult test will be initiated.
So it just keeps going.
The underlying argument is that feminism has validated this behavior, framing it as a woman's right to demand constant emotional labor from her partner.
But the author goes deeper than just describing the behavior. She attempts to explain the root psychological cause behind this hostility, and she borrows a concept from the famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung.
I think we need another, I'm 5 here.
Let's do it.
What is animus possession, and how does the book apply a 20th century psychological theory to modern dating dynamics?
In Jungian psychology, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman. Jung posited that if a woman does not properly integrate her animus, she can become possessed by it, leading to rigid, argumentative, and overly critical behavior.
Okay.
Riker adapts this concept to argue that modern feminism encourages animus possession on a mass scale.
How so? The text asserts that women are encouraged to project their own unresolved personal traumas, specifically issues like father abandonment or past relationship failures, onto the entirety of the male population.
Ah, I see.
Instead of engaging in the difficult work of dealing with their individual psychological pain, they externalize it, blaming a mythical, omnipresent patriarchy for all their suffering.
To illustrate the most extreme endpoint of this animus possession, the book points to a historical figure, Valerie Solanas. For listeners who might not know, Solanas authored the SCUM Manifesto in the late 1960s, which literally stands for the Society for Cutting Up Men. She also famously attempted to assassinate Andy Warhol. How does Riker use Solanas in her argument?
The author uses Solanas and the SCUM Manifesto as the logical, unfiltered conclusion of feminist ideology.
The logical conclusion.
Yes. Riker argues that while modern feminists might distance themselves from Solanas' violence, the underlying psychological architecture is the same. The text claims this ideology is rooted not in a desire for genuine equality, but in a deep, pathological, and unaddressed hatred of men.
Building off that psychological critique, the author introduces another major concept, this time pulling from evolutionary biology, the dual mating strategy.
This is a core part of her argument.
How does the text explain female biological imperatives, and how does feminism supposedly exploit them?
The book argues that from an evolutionary standpoint, women are biologically driven by two competing imperatives.
What are they?
On one hand, they need to secure long-term resources, physical stability, and protection to raise children, which they seek from one type of man, the dependable, stable provider.
Okay.
On the other hand, the text argues they are simultaneously biologically driven to seek the best possible genetic material and physical excitement from another type of man, often categorized as the aggressive bad boy or alpha archetype.
And the author claims that when society removes traditional moral constraints, this dual mating strategy leads directly to an epidemic of paternity fraud.
Exactly.
The idea that a woman will secure genetics from the bad boy, but secure the financial resources from the stable provider, tricking him into raising another man's child. And there is a legal fact in the book regarding this that completely floored me. Can you explain the author's point about paternity testing in France?
Yes, the author points to the legal code in France, where commercial, at-home DNA paternity testing is strictly illegal.
Strictly illegal.
A man cannot legally test a child's DNA without explicit approval from a judge in a court of law. Riker points to this statute as the ultimate proof of what she calls a gynocracy.
Define gynocracy as the author uses it here.
The author defines a gynocracy as a system where the state uses its absolute legal and legislative power to protect female interests at the direct expense of male rights.
So in this case,
In the case of France, the text argues the state is actively protecting a woman's ability to deceive a man about the biological paternity of the child he is legally obligated to raise and financially support. It prioritizes the mother's reputation and the child's financial stability over the man's right to know the truth.
so if the dual mating strategy is the biological hardware, the author argues that modern hookup culture is the software running on it. According to the book, this culture was born directly out of the feminist sexual revolution. How does the author measure the cultural fallout of framing promiscuity as liberation?
By analyzing the commodification of relationships, the text argues that by stripping sex of its traditional ties to marriage and family, the sexual revolution turned intimacy into a transactional marketplace.
She has data on this.
Yes, the author cites a 2018 sociological study showing the devastating result of this shift. The data indicates that 70% of young adults now feel deeply emotionally disconnected and report severe struggles in forming lasting, meaningful romantic relationships.
The book actually uses a very modern, relatable example to highlight this. Riker mentions a viral Instagram post from a young woman who publicly confessed her deep regret over her so-called hoe phase.
I remember reading that part.
This woman admitted that her pursuit of feminist sexual liberation didn't empower her. It just left her feeling incredibly empty, lonely, and fundamentally disconnected from her partners. Why does the author include this anecdote?
To demonstrate that the system she is critiquing is ultimately harmful to everyone. The author uses this viral post to argue that feminism's push for promiscuity is actively damaging women as well, by stripping human sexuality of its required vulnerability, intimacy, and trust, replacing it with a hollow consumerist approach to human connection.
If we look at how all these interpersonal dynamics synthesize, the author claims they culminate in what she calls the apology epidemic and widespread cultural gaslighting.
Yes.
How does she define those terms in the context of male-female interactions?
The text argues that feminism has successfully executed a cultural gaslighting campaign by mainstreaming slogans like, "Believe all women."
How does that play out?
According to the author, this slogan fundamentally shifts the societal burden of proof. It creates an environment where men are presumed guilty in the court of public opinion until proven innocent.
And the apology epidemic.
The apology epidemic refers to the resulting psychological state where men are forced to constantly second-guess their own reality, apologize for their natural masculine behaviors, and carry a deep systemic sense of guilt simply for existing as men in a modern society.
Which brings us to arguably the most intense part of the book, and something I know the audience listening right now is deeply concerned about: the legal weaponization and what the author provocatively calls the marriage plantation.
It's a very strong term.
Riker does not mince words here. She describes the institution of modern state-sanctioned marriage as a literal legal trap. How does she justify comparing marriage to a plantation where men are treated as walking ATMs?
She justifies this extreme terminology by analyzing the financial and legal realities of divorce. The financial statistics provided in the book are incredibly stark. The author claims that currently, men pay 97% of all court-ordered alimony.
97%. And how does she contextualize that 97% figure against modern economic realities?
The author argues that current alimony laws are completely archaic. She states they are stuck in a 1950s paradigm, designed for an era when women rarely worked outside the home and genuinely required financial support after a divorce.
But things have changed.
Exactly. Today, the text points out that women significantly outnumber men in college enrollment and have vastly closed the wage gap. Despite this economic parity, the author argues that the legal system still overwhelmingly awards alimony to women.
So what's her conclusion?
Therefore, Riker concludes that alimony has morphed from a necessary safety net into a form of permanent passive income, a system that legally and financially enslaves ex-husbands to women who are perfectly capable of supporting themselves.
And if alimony is the financial trap, the book frames the family court system as ground zero for the war on fatherhood. What specific data points does the author use to support the claim that family courts are inherently biased against men?
The author presents statistics indicating that men lose 85% of all contested custody battles.
85%.
Furthermore, the text states that fathers are 3 times more likely to be entirely denied visitation rights than mothers are.
The book makes a very bold claim about those statistics. The author argues this isn't just an accidental byproduct of a clumsy legal system. She claims that creating a fatherless society is a deliberate, calculated feminist goal. Why would that be the goal?
According to the book's ideological framework, the goal is to systematically remove male authority and influence from the home, thereby making women and children more dependent on the state. The author points to the societal cost of this outcome, citing extensive data from the U.S. Census Bureau. The text shows that fatherless homes strongly correlate with a cascade of societal failures, including massively higher high school dropout rates, increased youth delinquency, and significantly higher violent crime rates.
There is a specific legal framework used in family courts that the author heavily criticizes here. I need another explain it. Like, I'm 5, this time for the Duluth model. What exactly is this model, and how does the author say it is weaponized against men in domestic dispute cases?
The Duluth model is a framework developed in the 1980s in Duluth, Minnesota, designed to handle domestic violence cases.
Right.
The author explains that this model is explicitly rooted in feminist theory, operating on the premise that domestic violence is entirely about patriarchal power and male control over women.
What does that mean practically?
According to the book, this model trains police officers, social workers, and judges to view the man as the default aggressor in any domestic dispute, regardless of the specific facts of the incident. Riker argues this leads to a system where women are viewed as perpetual victims and innocent men are routinely arrested, removed from their homes, and separated from their children based on mere accusations without any physical evidence of wrongdoing.
And speaking of accusation, the author dedicates an entire, highly detailed chapter to what she calls the false allegation epidemic. Now, to be clear on her methodology, she does acknowledge the mainstream statistics. She notes that statistically only 2 to 10% of rape allegations are definitively proven false.
Right, she includes those numbers.
But she argues that small percentage completely fails to capture the true devastation occurring in society. Why does she say that number is misleading?
Because, the author argues, the standard of proof has been completely eroded, making it impossible to know how many unproven allegations are actually false. She specifically points to the disciplinary tribunals on college campuses operating under Title IX.
Can you break down her critique of Title IX? Because the standard of proof there is very different from a criminal court.
Exactly. In a criminal court, you must be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But under the Title IX guidelines, the author critiques, the standard of proof is reduced to a mere preponderance of evidence.
Which means what exactly?
In legal terms, that means 50.1% certainty. The author argues that this insanely low threshold means a literal flip of a coin can destroy a young man's life, get him expelled from his university, brand him a predator, and permanently ruin his future career prospects, all without the accused having the right to proper legal counsel or the ability to cross-examine his accuser.
The book cites some massive high-profile cultural examples to illustrate the shift in the burden of proof, specifically the media circuses surrounding Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and former Senator Al Franken. How does the author use these two very different political figures to make her point?
She uses them to demonstrate that this phenomenon crosses political lines. The author argues that in both cases, the foundational principles of due process were entirely replaced by mob rule. The text asserts that in the modern cultural climate, an unverified, decades-old allegation is now sufficient to secure a conviction in the court of public opinion, completely bypassing the need for evidence or a fair trial.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener?
It's a big question.
The author's view is that under these heavily skewed, feminist-captured legal and cultural frameworks, men are taking on an absolutely immense, almost unjustifiable level of risk by participating in marriage or even engaging in casual interpersonal interactions in the workplace or on campus. The overarching conclusion of this section of the book is that the system is fundamentally structurally rigged against you.
And this systemic rigging is deeply connected to a broader cultural phenomenon that the author calls the victimhood Olympics and the resulting empathy gap, which we explore in the next major section of our deep dive.
Let's do it.
The text argues that we now live in a society where cultural status, political power, and institutional funding are gained primarily by claiming the highest level of systemic oppression.
So how does the author quantify this empathy gap between men and women?
The book posits that because intersectional feminist ideology categorically defines men as the ultimate oppressors, any genuine suffering experienced by men is either entirely ignored or actively mocked by society.
And she pulls data for this.
She pulls some very sobering statistics to illustrate this gap. She notes that men make up 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%.
Furthermore, relying on data from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, she points out that men account for a staggering 80% of all suicide deaths.
And the author's point is that if those statistics were flipped, if women made up 93% of workplace deaths and 80% of suicides, it would be a national emergency.
Exactly.
Yet, as she points out, society and feminist organizations remain completely silent. There are no national marches, no massive government funding campaigns, and no media outrage for the men dying in industrial accidents on oil rigs, or the men taking their own lives because they lost access to their children in family court.
The author attributes much of this specific male mental health crisis to what she terms the toxic masculinity double bind.
The double bind.
She argues that modern men are caught in an inescapable psychological trap. On one hand, society and millions of years of evolutionary biology still implicitly expect men to man up, to be stoic providers, protectors, and to succeed in highly competitive environments.
Right. That expectation hasn't gone away.
On the other hand, mainstream feminist rhetoric constantly shames them for possessing these very traits, explicitly labeling male dominance, competitiveness, and traditional masculinity as toxic.
It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Because the book points out that if a man actually listens to feminist advice, tries to conform to these new ideals, and shows emotional vulnerability in his professional life, he's punished for it. The author cites a 2019 workplace study to prove this. What did that study find?
The 2019 study, cited in the text, analyzed professional advancement based on behavioral traits. It found that men who openly displayed emotional vulnerability or shared their personal struggles in the workplace were 30% less likely to be promoted to leadership positions compared to their more stoic male peers.
30% less likely.
The author uses this data to prove that the feminist demand for male vulnerability is a trap. Society still fundamentally rewards men for traditional masculine competence, while simultaneously punishing them socially for exhibiting it.
To show what happens when an entire society fully embraces this top-down ideological engineering, the author dedicates significant space to what she calls the Swedish experiment. She uses Sweden as the ultimate cautionary tale of trying to force a sociological ideology to override basic human biology. What specific policies in Sweden does the book analyze?
The author focuses heavily on Sweden's attempts at radical gender neutrality. She details their implementation of gender-neutral preschools, where the state actively tried to socialize traditional gender behaviors out of young children.
By doing what?
Banning the use of gendered pronouns and strictly controlling the types of toys available. The author claims the experiment was a fundamental failure because, despite the intense social engineering, biological imperatives prevailed.
What happened?
The boys still overwhelmingly gravitated toward rough and tumble play and mechanical toys like trucks, while the girls gravitated towards social and nurturing play.
The book also looks at the Swedish military in this context, right?
Yes. The text analyzes the integration of women into frontline combat roles in the Swedish military.
What were the results?
The author claims that to achieve numerical gender parity, the military was forced to significantly lower its physical fitness and load-bearing standards, which the book argues directly compromised the operational effectiveness and lethality of their combat units. Riker uses this to argue that prioritizing ideological equality over biological reality always results in a degraded system.
The book also weighs into one of the most highly controversial topics in our culture, abortion, but she approaches it from a very specific angle, framing it not as an issue of women's health care or bodily empowerment, but as a silent genocide. How does the author construct the argument that abortion is a tool of feminist control?
The author's argument is that feminist ideology utilizes abortion as a mechanism to entirely avoid personal accountability, prioritizing radical individualism over the survival of the traditional family unit.
And the male perspective.
The text heavily emphasizes the male perspective, highlighting the deep, unacknowledged psychological scars left on men. The author points out that under current legal frameworks, men are entirely legally powerless. They have absolutely no say, no veto power, and no legal rights regarding the life or death of their unborn children, reducing them to mere biological donors without agency.
It's an incredibly heavy chapter. The author really contrasts this whole victimhood Olympics, where she argues people win societal status by proving how helpless and oppressed they are with the historical and biological reality of men.
Yeah, she paints a very different picture of men.
The text paints men as the ultimate builders and protectors of civilization. She points out the stark hypocrisy of feminist academics sitting in comfortable boardrooms and air-conditioned universities, criticizing the patriarchy, while completely ignoring the fact that it was men who built those buildings.
Right.
She cites men building the Golden Gate Bridge, laying the interstate highway systems, and executing the Apollo missions. Her argument is that men did the incredibly dangerous, dirty, and fatal work to build the very civilization that modern feminists now complain about.
This comprehensive critique raises a vital practical question, which the author addresses in the final chapters of the book. How does one actively resist?
Exactly. What's the solution?
If the legal, educational, and corporate institutions are as heavily captured as the author claims, what are the solutions for men living in this environment? The author provides a detailed, multi-tiered framework for actionable resistance, beginning with the foundational role of religion.
Let's dig into that, because she argues that feminism attacks traditional religion with such ferocity precisely because religion offers a strong competing moral framework. How does the book say religion counters feminist ideology?
The text asserts that traditional religious frameworks promote concepts like the nuclear family, absolute moral duty, self-sacrifice, and personal accountability.
Yeah.
These concepts directly challenge the feminist focus on moral relativism, radical individualism, and perpetual victimhood. The author backs this up with sociological data, noting that actively religious men consistently report significantly higher baseline life satisfaction and demonstrably lower divorce rates than their secular counterparts.
But she also issues a very stark warning to the listeners regarding the modern church. She tells men to actively avoid churches or religious institutions that are adopting gender-neutral liturgy or pandering to progressive intersectional politics. Why does she argue that is a fatal mistake for a church?
Because, according to her analysis, institutions that try to appease feminist ideology inevitably destroy themselves. The author states that by watering down traditional doctrine to avoid offending progressives, these churches alienate their strong masculine core base, while simultaneously failing to attract the feminists they are trying to appease, ultimately losing their followers and their cultural influence entirely.
Beyond finding a grounded spiritual community, the author strongly urges men to participate in and financially support men's rights groups and alternative media ecosystems. She argues that traditional mainstream media is a completely lost cause. What specific platforms or figures does she point to as the blueprint for this resistance?
The author heavily cites independent alternative media platforms as the last bastion of free thought. She specifically points to the Red Pill podcast space and highly influential figures like Dr. Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan.
And why are they important?
The text argues that these spaces are vital because they allow for data-driven resistance and open conversations about male psychology and biology, successfully bypassing the algorithmic censorship of the mainstream digital platforms we discussed earlier.
The conclusion of the book is basically a direct call to action. Riker outlines very specific tactical steps for the listener to take to reclaim their autonomy. Let's walk through them.
Okay.
Number 1, she suggests parents seriously consider homeschooling their children. This is her proposed method to protect the next generation from the intersectional feminist and Marxist indoctrination she claims is rampant in the public school system.
Number 2, she advocates for economic resistance, urging men to vote with their wallets. The text instructs readers to actively boycott massive corporations that push the toxic masculinity narrative in their marketing.
She gives a specific example, right?
So she specifically calls out and dissects that infamous Gillette commercial as a prime example of corporate misandry that should be financially penalized by male consumers.
Number 3, get involved locally. She argues that complaining on the internet changes nothing. The book urges men to run for the local school board, to run for city council, and to engage in local political office to stop these ideological policies at the grassroots level before they take root.
And finally, she emphasizes internal work.
Yes. Prioritize your own physical and mental self-improvement, build strong offline solidarity with other men, and above all else, absolutely refuse to apologize for your natural masculinity.
It is a highly comprehensive framework for resistance. The entire strategy relies heavily on the premise that strong male solidarity, coupled with a complete, uncompromising refusal to participate in the psychological double-bind, is the ultimate weapon against the gynocentric system described throughout the text.
That is the core, defining message the author wants you, the listener, to walk away with. Her argument is that you have to recognize the institutional game being played, you must refuse to internalize the historical guilt they attempt to place on you, and you must actively build a life, financially, socially, and spiritually, that is completely immune to their manipulation.
As we conclude this extensive deep dive into the text, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you process these arguments.
Go ahead.
Throughout the book, the author relies heavily on the foundational assertion that traditional gender roles are not social constructs, but are rooted in deep, unchangeable evolutionary biology. She cites the extensive works of evolutionary psychologists like David Geary in his book Male, Female, and the broad historical analyses of anthropologists like Jared Diamond.
Right.
If we accept this premise, If these biological differences, such as men's innate drive to build, compete, and protect, and women's distinct evolutionary mating strategies, are truly as deeply ingrained in our DNA as the author suggests, it begs a massive historical question.
Which is?
Can any top-down institutional policy, whether mandated by the government, enforced by corporate HR departments, or taught in academia, ever truly erase them? Or will the relentless systemic attempt to socially engineer these biological realities out of existence inevitably lead to the exact societal collapse, cultural friction, and psychological crisis that the author so direly warns about?
That is something to seriously think about as you look at the trajectory of the world around you today. All right, that is going to wrap up our deep dive for today.
It's been a long one.
It has. If you are part of the men's rights activist audience, or if you consider yourself a red-pilled man looking to deeply understand the structural mechanics of the world we live in, you need to read these arguments in their full context.
Absolutely. Read the
Go
book.
to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook Feminism's Silent War: How Women Control and Destroy Men by Sophie Marie Eve Riker. Also, do not forget to follow at Conrad M. Riker at Substat for more incisive writing on these crucial topics.
You won't want to miss it.
And one last reminder from me, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this deep dive with anyone who needs to hear this analysis. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.